Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on the topic of performance testing and debugging for Telerik Sitefinity CMS. Today's presenters are Christopher Woodard, who is a Sitefinity Solutions consultant based in North America, Radoslav Georgiev, who is a Director of Engineering for Sitefinity at Telerik's headquarters in Bulgaria, and me, I'm Olgi Shopov with the Sitefinity Partner Program. The goal of today's webinar is to talk about how to avoid common performance issues with Sitefinity-based projects. We're going to talk about how to make performance debugging a part of your development process, what are the best tools for doing performance testing, and we'll also go over some recommendations for optimizing your projects for performance. The agenda for today is we're going to start with Chris, who will do a demonstration of debugging for performance with Sitefinity. Then he will also talk about the common culprits when it comes to performance, and he will also go over some recommendations for project optimizations. Then Radoslav will jump in and he'll talk about Sitefinity 7.1, which was recently released, and he will discuss the performance improvements that were introduced with that version. He will also talk about the future releases of Sitefinity and what we have planned with regards to performance, and some information about some exciting tools that we have in the pipeline and are soon to be released that will be very helpful when doing performance tuning. And finally, as usual, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So let's jump to the first point and get to the demonstration of debugging for performance with Sitefinity, which will be delivered by Chris.
Thanks, Ogi. So what I have here is a test project that I've set up just running off the Quantum demo project. And I've actually injected a little bit of slow code into this just so we can actually run through some scenarios for our webinar. What we'll do is we'll use Visual Studio for their web performance suite, and we're actually going to run through a couple of tests. We'll actually test all the pages to see which pages are taking a long time to load. And we'll actually take those pages that we get back as a result, and we'll use JustTrace to profile them. And that'll help us identify the actual code that's causing the issues. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into Visual Studio. All right, I've actually already created a test project for us here to use with some pages that we'll profile. You see here in that list. But if you guys actually want to create your own test project, what you'll do is you'll go into the solution here, Add, New Project, come into the test section, and you'll select the Web Performance and Load Test project. Okay. Once you create that, you'll actually right-click on your project, and go to Add, and add a new Web Performance test. When you do this, it's going to boot up Internet Explorer, and it's going to attach a recorder to it. So every page that you browse while you're in that session will actually be tracked, and it's going to keep track of all those requests and add them to your web tests, so that every time you run that test, it'll actually run through those same pages. Okay. So you'll get a similar result to what I have here with this web test, and I'm just profiling the products page and the Inside Quantum pages, and a couple of the About Us pages as well. Okay, so let's actually run through this web test and see how long things take to load. And I haven't loaded up Sitefinity here, so we may have, oh, we're good. I was going to say we might have the bootstrap time initially. Alright, so we ran through the first load here, and some of the pages had to compile. You see we had 3 second, the 2 second, the 1 second, even the 7 seconds here. Let's run through that one more time. The pages should be compiled and in cache now. You'll see the second time through, those pages were a lot quicker. So everything's under 1 second. We do see that one page is actually at 5 seconds here, and that's our news page. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that news page, we're going to use JustTrace on it, and we're going to profile the code in that page to identify what's causing the issue. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump into JustTrace here. We're going to use the improved performance setting here. Click into that, and we'll actually select an IIS profile. Select our Quantum project, leave all the default settings, And let's run. This will boot up a new browser tab, and it's going to actually attach Just Trace to that session. And this is going to take a little bit of time here. So when you run a profiler against a site, it's actually going to attach itself to every single method call that's being ran. So right now we're going through the bootstrapper and Sitefinity. So that normal bootstrap time that we have, which is a little long, is going to be amplified by the profiler because it's going to keep track of everything and give us metrics back for it. And actually, one thing to mention here is you will notice in our memory usage graph, we see it kind of doing a ladder thing here. It's jumping up, and this is actually every time we initialize a module in Sitefinity, it's storing some of that information in memory. So the bootstrapper, what happens during that is it does go through all those modules and the modules and services, and it goes through the initialization method. So if we actually wanted to speed up the bootstrap a little bit, what we could do is disable the modules that we aren't using. So if we aren't using email campaigns, or we aren't using the, maybe it's the personalization module, we could disable those and speed up the bootstrap for us a little bit. And we'll just wait here a bit for the site to load. Alright, looks like our site's loaded here. So let's go ahead and click on our news page. Now let's watch Just Trace. Okay, page is loaded. So let's go ahead and select the area here that we're actually going to profile. Alright, let's click into our begin process request. And we'll click into our request to our news page. And we'll click into the page service here. Alright, it looks like we have a couple of methods here, a little bit long. We have the create child controls and the page load. So let's click into this one. And this is actually when it's resolving the detail item for news. And it doesn't look like it's flagging that one as being an issue. So let's go ahead and click into page load. Alright, we have our news tag control here. So this is actually a custom control that I've added over here on the right side for tags. And we notice that inside of our bind news repeater refactored method, we have a 5-second load time. And inside of that, we see a sleep method. And this has actually been flagged as a hotspot. So if we wanted to see all the hotspots real quick, we could actually come over on the left side to our caller trees and actually just select the hotspots. So we see we have a couple of hotspots here, compile control, which is actually where it's compiling, and then we have our thread.sleep, which is lasting 5 seconds. Okay. So now what we'll actually do is we'll go into Visual Studio and take a peek of our news tags control, so we can actually see where the sleep statement's being called and take care of removing that issue. So let's go ahead and kill our profile here. And because I'm detaching from the process and detaching Just Trace from that process, we're actually going to have to load the site back up here. I might get that bootstrap again. So let's go ahead and load that up. While that goes, though, let's go back to Visual Studio and let's take a look at our control. Alright, so I got a simple repeater. Let's come into the code behind where the issue was. And we have this bind news repeater method here. This just goes through the taxonomy statistics and gets a list of the tags that are available for the news data type. Okay, and we'll see here we have this thread that's sleep. This is where our issue is actually occurring. So what I've done is I've actually created a duplicate of this control without the sleep method in there, and I've added it to another Sitefinity page. And you probably noticed it when I was in Chrome here, once this finishes loading. What I typically recommend doing is if you are testing performance issues with a widget or a control, is keep the old version of it accessible and create a duplicate page with the new and old control on either one. And what that's going to do for you is you can actually see the performance increase in the web tests. So I've actually got this news refactored page right here, and this has the widget without the sleep method in it. So if we come back to Visual Studio, what we're going to do is actually add that additional page to our list. So let's go ahead and copy our news request. Let's paste, and then we'll switch out the URL. All right, and we'll do a save. And because we're no longer running in Just Trace, and this is back to our normal IIS site, all of our pages aren't cached. So we may see a longer time than we did originally, and that's just because Sitefinity is going to go through and compile those pages. If a page hasn't been hit in a while, the page isn't compiled, and .NET doesn't have that to request. So it's got to compile that page, and then Sitefinity will actually cache that. So let's go ahead and run this test. And the reason it's taking a little long here is I think I left Just Trace open, so I didn't actually kill that process entirely. So now Sitefinity is going through that bootstrap again.
So while this is loading, so one of the questions that came in through the chat window is whether you recommend that these are run against the full version of IIS or whether IIS Express is sufficient. Do you have any thoughts on that?
IIS Express should be efficient. What I use here for the Visual Studio one is actually running against a regular IIS site. So I just set up a IIS site for localhost 5020 with Quantum, and I usually run the Visual Studio tests through that. Just Trace, you can actually profile it with IIS Express or IIS. But even when you run it through IIS, it will kind of hook it to its own process. So when you close out Just Trace, you'll have the increased boot up time. So I recommend when you can do it through IIS. It'll just a little faster that way. And it looks like, let's come back to Chrome here. Let's go ahead and restart that test. I think something got hooked up there. Yep, so if we come back in and run that again, there we go. We just got stuck. All right, so we see here that the majority of the requests are pretty quick. our original news request was still 5 seconds, and now we can compare that to the new news refactored page with the control without the sleep statement, which is not even a second. So we slow that down significantly, and obviously we've got a couple here which are a little higher, and these pages just weren't compiled and they weren't in Sitefinity's cache. So if we were to do another request here, they would probably be quicker. Okay, now everything's below a second other than our one news request with that sleep statement in there. Now, not everything is actually going to be code-based. It's not all going to be just Visual Studio C# code that's calling this in the slowdown. Sometime you might actually have like a really complex SQL query that's taking a really time to load, or you may have a control that's making 1,000 SQL queries and you don't know that from the way your code's running. A good way to make sure that SQL is not an issue is using SQL Profiler, and I've actually opened that here. I don't have a SQL bug in here for us to run through, but if you wanted to make sure that there isn't an issue, what you can do is run this profiler and actually attach it specifically to your database name. So you see all the SQL requests or transactions that are going through for your database. So if we come in and actually do a new trace, and I'll go ahead and connect my machine here, bring over my properties. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and actually use the tuning template. And then we'll come over to event selection. This is where we're going to actually set up a filter on our database name. So we'll come into column filters. And we should have database name here. And our database is just named Quantum. All right, so we'll go ahead and run this. And just to test, let's go ahead and actually see if we request the home page. Okay, so now we can see a lot of stored procedures being executed. We can also see some additional queries being executed here as it goes through and tries to render all that information. And then the way we would actually determine if something's running slow would be this duration column. This is going to tell us the amount of time that that query is actually taken to run. Okay, so this is just another one of the tools you can use. So let's discuss some of the common culprits that cause some slowdown in Sitefinity. Now, one of the ones that a lot of people don't notice, and this is common when there's an agency working on a project and they build out the shell for the Sitefinity site to the theming, the custom code, and they hand that off to their client who maybe has a content editor or a marketing team that edits the site, adds content and images. But we find a lot that there are actually some really large images in the sites that are, scaling down, but what they really don't notice is they're using like a 7 megabyte image for something that could easily be, 10, 20 kilobytes, if that. So we highly recommend, if you have the time in the project, go through the libraries that the client's going to be using, or even set the default library. There's two options in Sitefinity. You can use the max image size property for a library, and that'll actually restrict them from uploading images larger than so many kilobytes. So maybe you want to make the limitation 2 meg, and you can say, hey, anything over 2 meg we're not going to allow. We'll send an error message. That way they know they got to go in and actually optimize the image first. Another option is you can actually automatically resize the images for a library, so you can actually set all of them to be shrunken down before Sitefinity saves them. That way when they use them on their pages, they're automatically shrunk. Okay. The next one here, link deferred execution. This is going to be that common example of running a to-list on a query. So if you're using like the news manager and you're getting a list of news back, if you run a .to-list on that, you're actually running that query against the database. Whereas if you just took the iQueryable that the getNewsItem method gives you, that's not actually executing anything yet. It doesn't get executed until it's ran on the front end via a data bind, or until you actually run a to-list or some kind of a numeral method on it. So they have the option. More often than not, you'll want to leave those two lists out of there. There are some cases where you may run into an issue because a queryable object doesn't have the same method as a .to list, but there should be ways around that. Okay. Paging and filtering. An example of the news module, if you are querying back all the news items, make sure that you're doing a skip or take on those queries. That way you're not querying back all the items when you actually need 10 or 20 of them. I sometimes see this when developers plan on implementing client-side paging or filtering. They'll query back the full list, and then they'll implement the paging and filtering in the JavaScript. And while this is really nice because it's running all client-side, it still causes an issue in performance. So even if you are doing some client-side paging and filtering, I highly recommend only pulling back the items that you need for that specific page. And Sitefinity has web services for just about all the content modules, and those support paging and filtering on them. So you could hook your client-side paging and filtering up to the web services and only take the items you need. And disabled output cache. The output cache one is important. That's what's going to speed up the site because it's not having to rerun all those requests. I see this pretty frequently, mostly when a developer implements like a Twitter feed type widget or something that has dynamic content in it, where they say, hey, I don't want this to cache. They run into issues when they're looking at the page because they're not seeing the new tweets showing up, and that's because Sitefinity is actually caching that control. Their resolution to that is just to set the page to not cache at all, or to actually go into the settings of the system and turn off output cache entirely, which is not good. Sitefinity has what's called a cache substitution wrapper class. And this will actually allow you to basically inject your own dynamic content into the cached page before it's loaded. That way the rest of the page can still remain cached, and you're only going to inject your dynamic content just into that one widget. It gives you some control there so you don't have to turn off caching for the whole page. That's a big performance improvement for disabling the output cache. Okay. Some common performance recommendations. The output cache time. By default, Sitefinity actually keeps that about 2 minutes. You can increase this, and I highly recommend increasing that, unless you have content that's being updated very often. And in production, you usually don't have that happening too much. But what I would recommend is maybe start with 20 minutes and start bumping that up. I mean, I've seen instances where it's even an hour, and it's been perfectly fine. So play with it, increase the time. If you're seeing that a certain time isn't working out, bump it back down. But you should be able to definitely increase it over that 2-minute limit. And that'll keep users from having to come to a page and run through that compilation time for a page. Okay. And for those who don't know how to find this setting, in the back end of Sitefinity, if you go Administration, Settings, Advanced Settings, it's going to be underneath there inside of the System node. Okay. The disabled unused modules, I actually mentioned this earlier. If there are modules that you're not using in the system, actually come into Sitefinity and disable those. And I'll actually just show those real quick. Let's come back to our Quantum site and log into the back end. Okay, so for the output cache, if we come into Administration, Settings, Advanced, and we scroll down at the bottom, come to System, and we come to Output Cache Settings. So right now, just because I was doing some profiling, I want to make sure we had real statistics being shown, I actually disabled the output cache. Enabling that will make sure that everything loads up a lot quicker when subsequent requests are made to them. If you want to increase the time for this, first you'd enable it, but you can come into the output cache profiles, come into standard caching, and then increase this duration. This is in seconds, so I've got 2 minutes enabled right now. Okay. For the unused modules, if we come back to our site, and we go to Administration, we'll come into Modules and Services. So this is a list of all the modules being used in Sitefinity currently. If, for example, we're not using backend services, Marketo, Salesforce, or SharePoint, we could just come into these connectors and deactivate them. And that'll actually keep that bootstrap time down a lot. Okay. So if you have the option for it and the client's traffic warrants it, I would recommend considering load balancing. That's going to speed up the site significantly because you obviously get the benefit of having two CPUs running all the processes and kind of splitting those between two machines. Another option is to use site sync. So if you have one production server, and I've seen this a lot where all of the authoring changes are actually made on the production server because they want their changes to show up immediately, which is understandable. But the one thing you got to keep in mind is you're taking all of the back-end requests and all the front-end requests that the visitors are coming in with, and those are being shared on one machine. So it's trying to serve up those requests simultaneously to both ends. If you decouple the authoring experience from the presentation, have a separate server for it, you can keep the production server focused on just delivering the content to the front-end users. And you can do this via site sync. So you would actually set up an authoring and a production server and site sync from the authoring server to the production. So you make your changes on the authoring server and either set up a scheduled sync, so it's nightly in your downtime, or sync as you need to the production server.
And this also has the added benefit of security, right?
Yeah. So if you shut off the back end on the production server, then you don't have to worry about people somehow getting into the production machine and making changes or hacking their way in. I haven't seen it happen yet, but just as an additional security bonus, that would be one, yes. Okay. Configure the recycle time. Most of these are taken off of our documentation. The configure recycle time, we've actually got a link on our documentation, which will be in our resources section at the end of this webinar. But what this is going to do is, when your application recycles, the next visitor will likely get a really slow load time because they have to wait for Sitefinity to go through that bootstrap. During this time, it's initially installs all the modules, but we recommend to configure the application recycle every 24 hours and have it during a time of off hours, so maybe in the middle of the night. And you can also configure that, and we highly recommend configuring it, to have it automatically restart after the recycle. So your application stops and automatically starts back up in the middle of the night. You didn't have to do any manual work there, and that keeps the site fresh and kind of refreshes the memory for it. Okay. And this one isn't too common, but it still happens every now and then. If you're not using like MS Deploy or something to automatically push your site up, and maybe you're just going into the Visual Studio solution, you're copying out all the files in Sitefinity web app, and you're deploying that directly to your production machine. Sometimes you'll notice that you still have the debug mode turned off, or have debug mode turned on in your web config file. Debug mode does slow down the site, so I highly recommend making sure you go in there and check that that's off before you flip the switch on production. Okay. And one that I don't have on this list, but I'll talk through it, is a page compilation service. So this one's actually mentioned in our documentation, and I just want to kind of expand on what it says. A page compilation service is, so all the pages in Sitefinity get compiled on request if they haven't been compiled already. And that's .NET doing that compilation. And then we also cache that compilation later. What you can do is actually set up some kind of service. And this is going to make it so your pages are automatically compiled on the server for when the next visitor hits. Nobody will get that initial slow time. There are a couple ways to do this. You can create a web service and a scheduled task in Sitefinity and have that automatically generate a web request to every page in your sitemap. Or maybe it's just the pages that get a lot of hits. You could also use like a Windows scheduled task and a PowerShell script that would generate a web request to an Excel file of page URLs. And what it's going to do is it's going to hit it on an intermittent basis. So you could say, hey, every 5 minutes I want to hit these 50 pages, make sure they're fresh. We need to make sure that those are fast so everyone can get to them. Okay. This process it's going to decrease the load on the CPU, but it's going to increase the memory consumption because you're actually going to be caching a lot of that information. You're not going to have to request it. More often than not, that's a pretty good trade-off because memory nowadays is pretty cheap, and it's a lot more. It's a lot easier to get a lot of memory than it is to get a lot of CPU boost. So if you do have a dedicated server or even a virtual server, I would highly recommend going this this approach. All right, and I'm actually going to pass it back over to the guys in Sophia.
Thanks, Chris. Well, that was a great demonstration, and important thing that I got out of it is that those checklists, as I would call them, of items, like the common problems that you encounter and recommendations for improving performance. I think everybody who's working with Sitefinity should have those lists handy and go through that every time they're experiencing some kind of a performance problem, because as we talked about in the beginning, usually it's something very common. Sometimes it's hard for us to identify it at first glance. But that was a great presentation. Thank you for doing that for us. Now we're going to move on to the next chapter in this webinar. We're going to talk about Sitefinity 7.1's performance improvements. And as I said in the beginning, with me here I have Radoslav from the product team, and he's going to tell us what they've done to the product to achieve those impressive numbers that I saw in the performance tests that were published in the documentation. And also talk about what's coming up in the future releases. And one thing I just wanted to mention before I hand over to Rado is that he was also working with the team that put together Telerik.com and Sitefinity.com, including the partner extranet, which most of you are using on a regular basis. So he also has a lot of experience with implementing large-scale projects, I might add, because Telerik.com and Sitefinity are pretty busy websites in a well-balanced environment, in a multi-site environment. So I'm sure you have learned a lot of lessons there as well.
Thank you, Ogi, for the introduction. Yes, basically the idea around the 7.1 performance improvements was to see where our customers are mostly suffering with performance issues. We have talked to a number of our partners and made some interviews with a number of customers that were expressing performance issues. So after we got the areas where we considered are the most painstaking for everyone, we started running, just as Chris here demonstrated, we started running our profiling tools. We used Just Trace, we used the SQL profiler, we used also the open access profiler to gather all the necessary data that we need in order to conduct the performance improvements. So basically we had to identify the problems. Most of them were very hard to get because under normal circumstances you wouldn't see those you wouldn't see this as a performance bottleneck, but given, for example, a very stressed out project where you have a lot of requests going in, every slowdown, even if it's in a couple of milliseconds, if you multiply it by the amount of the requests that you get, you are actually having a performance bottleneck. So having this talks with clients, we're also having the experience from what we did with Telerik.com, and there we actually have implemented health monitoring using New Relic. It was mentioned a little bit earlier in the slides. So basically New Relic gave us a complete overview of the average amount of time each request on our live environment takes, the number of database calls it makes, what are the possible requests that are bottlenecks. And we started seeing some results in New Relic, and it started suggesting us that in certain areas of the website there actually is a problem with performance. So what we did is we simulated pretty much took the requests that are served by Telerik.com servers for a given period of time. So we used these requests to make stress test, which is very similar to what Christopher has showcased earlier, but instead of using just randomizing some page get requests here, we used all the available data that we had from our traffic on Telerik.com. So running those stress tests using just trace, SQL Profiler and Open Access Profiler, we have identified a number of areas where we can definitely improve and have a big difference in the performance. So basically the main areas that we focused were the pages backend screen. There we have actually utilized our own sitemap. Up until that we were always getting the pages, but we have found a way to use the sitemap and actually leverage its caching capabilities. So not always to run the same request for the current user, but actually to get the available pages from the application's cache. We have also focused a lot of media content. We have found out that we are firing too many queries to the SQL Server, so we have found some possible N+1 problems, and we have minimized drastically the amount of queries that are fired to the SQL Server in order to get the results. Other areas of focus were specifically in cases where we have a large deployment, such as Telerik.com website might be, because we consider it a larger deployment because it currently operates on 6 nodes, just to handle the to have optimal traffic. So basically there we're using NLB, and when you are using NLB, you need at every point in time your web servers need to know if the data that they have cached is relevant. So we have implemented such notification service that each web server can notify the rest that it knows about that content has been changed, so that they can evict their cache for that particular object. While this is working very well in the output cache, we still were lacking this in database query caching, because we're using open access, and when you're using open access you can leverage its level 2 caching, and it will actually cache the SQL statements results. When you're using selects, for example, it will cache those, and instead of going to the SQL Server it will return it from memory. So this was a challenge to have this implemented in an environment where you have multiple servers, and each of those servers should also know that the level 2 cache for a particular object is not relevant anymore. So we have taken the time to allow actually NLB scenarios to make use of second level cache in open access, and this is very well described in the performance improvements report. Other improvement that is not getting a lot of the spotlight of the release, but it is also very important for me, is that now you have the opportunity to integrate your media content with the CDN. So for example, if you already have a Cloudflare account or some other CDN, you can leverage it, and basically you can configure your Sitefinity libraries while it will still store the actual media content within Sitefinity. It will use the CDN as a proxy, and basically you will offload a huge chunk of your website traffic through a CDN. So this is something that definitely has to be considered by everyone that is doing a larger project. It will bring tremendous improvements when you offload this static content or media content traffic to the CDN.
Yeah, especially if it's a very media-heavy website. We see some websites are more on the text content, or it's just a few images that we're talking about. But we've seen a lot of customers that would run these enormous libraries. Some of it is user-generated, user-uploaded content, and I'm sure there it becomes very beneficial, makes a big difference.
Yep. So this is mainly on our performance improvements. You have to definitely take a look at the performance report, which is linked on this slide. It goes into detail on our testing methodology that we're utilizing, how we're deriving the results, what are the hardware configurations that we're using to get those results. So if you have any questions, for example, what kind of web servers we're using, what kind of SQL servers we're using, this describes it all very well there, and it also gives some suggestions on how you can create a possible performance testing setup. So for example, what Chris showcased here is useful for small scale projects, but for example, if you start using load tests that would actually simulate the traffic, let's say, for 1,000 concurrent visitors, this particular simulating of traffic will also be taxing on the machine where you're running the test. So what we're using here, we're separating this into another machine, so it doesn't compete with resources from the IIS on our application server. So as I said, you can take a look at the performance documentation report there. Also, we have improved the upgrade experience, and now we are aiming to make it much smoother to upgrade your Sitefinity projects. We're removing actually this requirement that you have to take 2 version steps. So you will not need to go, if you want to upgrade from 6.3, you will not need to go to, not 6.3 is not a good candidate, but 6.2, let's say. You will not have to go to 7.0 in order to upgrade to 7.1. You can directly upgrade from 6.2 project to 7.1, and we have also worked a lot on documenting this process. So we have invested a lot of effort to making the to make the guide more understandable. So if you have any problems with this guide, just let us know.
Yeah, this is actually at least in my eyes, this is a pretty big improvement, especially for the partner channel, because a lot of our partners are maintaining sites for their customers that are running on various versions. So upgrading has always been a touchy subject, especially if they're looking for an improvement or for a feature in Sitefinity available in the latest release, but they're more than 2 versions back on the production site. And it becomes more expensive, for the whole process of going through that extra step in there. So I think this is going to be well received, and it is new, as you said. We would really appreciate it if you can give us feedback on that, guys, and get us involved maybe in some of those upgrades, especially if it's a complicated project, which would make it more interesting from an upgrade point of view. So do let us know, and we'll work with you on that.
Mm-hmm. And if I can jump a little bit again on the performance, our experience with finding out the performance problems is that once you find out, for example, if someone is putting a to list, or if you're loading too many, you're making too many queries to the database, there's always ways to mitigate this for the future. For example, what we did is that we started using this FX Scope tool, which comes with Visual Studio, and it basically runs code quality analysis of your code, of your compiled assemblies, and you have the option to create your own code quality analysis rules. So what we have started doing is that we prepared a few small tools that would actually look at the code and let us know if someone is using a to-list statement. So again, this immediately raises a red flag there. Sometimes this can be a false negative in terms that you actually need to code the to-list statement, but a lot of the times there you don't need this. So we're using this to bring our attention to if someone from the team accidentally for some other reason puts it to less statement, we just need to know. We're also utilizing some other approaches. For example, when we're working on areas in Sitefinity where we have decided that we're going to cut down the amount of DB statements that are fired. For example, we're generating too many select statements, and after we have done a fix which is going to decrease the amount of queries that are fired to the SQL Server, we also create a test which, when it runs the code, it actually counts the amount of SQL statements that are fired, and we failed this test if it's above the accepted count. So these tests are also getting part of our continuous integration, and this is another approach to mitigate and to prepare for the future where someone can introduce a performance degradation problem. And this is anyway a continuous process. You cannot solve all of your performance at once and then forget about it, because the project is continuously developed and there's new code going in. So new features are getting implemented, and we need to know that we're stable in terms of performance.
Excellent. Well, thanks for giving us this insight. Unless you have anything else to add with regards to the product.
Yes, so with the product, we are continuing on this effort to optimize our performance. So we are getting also from our support channel a lot of requests for possible areas we can improve on. And if you also have some critical area that your customers is taking to they perceive it as a performance issue, let us know. Definitely we'll investigate and schedule it for the 7.2 release possibly. Right now what we are focusing on is implementing fetch strategies so that we minimize actually the amount of database calls. For example, one area of which we're actually currently improving is when you're working with the e-commerce API, or in general when you're working with the e-commerce module, is that there are some areas where we can drastically minimize the amount of DB queries that are made. So we're working on that regard there, and also doing this whole effort of optimizing our own performance gave us an idea that we implement a tool within Sitefinity, let's say a Sitefinity module, which will actually determine if your requests are slow and give you a possible culprit for this reason. So for example, let's say that we have a problem, we're generating way too many calls to the SQL database, or in general our data access logic is not correct and it is turning into a performance bottleneck. And if you're building on top of Sitefinity, in terms of that you're using our providers, you're using open access, we'll be able to tell this. So basically we started building, let's say, a performance diagnostics tool, which can be enabled as a module within Sitefinity, and it will start collecting data for every request that is made on the system. And for its first iteration, we're envisioning that we at least give developers the information that, for example, okay, look here at this particular request or that particular URL, you are generating way too many DB statements, and those DB statements are coming all from that particular piece of code or the other piece of code, or you have some other data access that is occurring, which we'll know about. This is for the first iteration of this module, and we're going to release it externally from Sitefinity, in terms of that it's not going to be part of the build that you get or the web application that you create from the project manager, but it will be published on our own Nugget server, and everyone will be able to get this and plug it into their project, install the module, and start collecting data.
So is that something that you would recommend people put on their production servers, or is this something that should only be used in development and staging?
It depends. I mean, as we've talked earlier, any kind of profiling is very taxing on the web server because it attaches performance counters. It starts writing to text files where it dumps the information. And if you were to enable this on your production server, I would recommend, for example, if you have a load balancing environment, you enable this only temporarily on one of the nodes.
I see.
Just to collect some sample data. Or you can enable it only for very short amount of time. It will be sufficient for this to collect the necessary data. But the best case would be if you know, for example, where your site traffic goes. And there's a number of tools you can get this from analytics. You can get the IIS logs. You can parse that data there, and you, based on this data, you devise a load test that will actually stress the web server similar to how users are interacting with it.
Right. And are the logs that are going to be generated from this tool, I assume they're going to be portable so they can be sent to our support guys?
Yeah, we're basically writing now in text files, which can be analyzed together with our support people. Actually, this will be how it will work in the first release. We're building this on top of the open access implementation for profiling. So we are also figuring out how if those logs can be actually plugged into the open access profiler, and that it automatically gives you some insights.
Nice. Excellent. Thank you. Well, we are almost on the hour, and I still wanted to maybe go through some questions. Before that, Chris has put on the screen a couple of links from the documentation that are related to performance specifically. We will distribute those after the webinar. They will be available on the partner extranet, so you'll get all of that along with the recording of the webinar. And for the Q&A, just a couple of questions that may be of interest to everybody. One that just popped up, and Rado, I think that one is more for you because it has to deal with upgrades, but the question is it possible to upgrade from 3 anything to 7.1? And before you address this, I just wanted to say that those are really architecturally two completely different products, so we shouldn't be talking about an upgrade there, but it's more of a migration. And as far as I know, you can still migrate content from 3.7 to 7.1. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So you can still migrate content, but it's not going to upgrade any custom controls because the APIs are completely different. The data structure is different. So it doesn't make any sense to do automatic upgrades there.
And you can actually, to answer that, there's a follow-up question. There is if people can get the users imported to the membership provider, which comes with Sitefinity 7.1. Yes, you can import the users.
Okay. One question that is for Chris, maybe, and it's Chris, when you were showing how to adjust the settings on the output caching, you mentioned that you had disabled output caching to run the traces when you were trying to locate the performance problem. And the question here is, should you always turn off output caching, or does it depend on the problem you're troubleshooting?
I don't know that you always need to disable it. It's just going to make those subsequent requests a little faster. Even in my Visual Studio Performance tests, you notice that my subsequent request was faster, and that's because I still had the compiled pages in .NET. The ASPX pages were actually compiled. They just weren't cached. So really what would happen there is it would just be a little faster. So it really doesn't matter either way if you want to go through the output cache or leave it off.
Yes, the thing is with just res is that it has to actually capture the one request to be able to tell if something is slow in there. And with output cache, you definitely have to be sure that you're capturing the first request. We disable output cache when we're profiling performance, just to make sure that every time we request the page or something else, is that we're actually running the code every single time and there's no cached response.
Okay, well, time is up for this webinar. I don't want to hold up anymore our attendees. Thank you both, Rado and Chris, for doing a great presentation today. I hope to do another one with the two of you soon. And I think this is a topic that it's going to be hard for us to just close with one webinar, performance testing, and new things are going to come up. So we'll definitely revisit it in the future. In the meantime, you guys, all the developers out there using the product, let us know if you encounter something. Let us know if there's something that we didn't cover, if it's not documented well. You know how to get a hold of us. We're more than happy to hear about it, get you an answer for it, and then maybe publish it so that everybody can benefit from that. Other than that, all of the resources and this webinar recording will be available on the Partner Extranet. And keep a lookout for the invitation to the next technical webinar. Thank you for being with us today. Till next time. Bye.